I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the truth, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
And I'm Matt Bernico, an online Christian thought leader. I'm just doing that from now on.
Yeah, it's great. I like it. And it's true. Last week, we started a new theme on postmodernism and Christianity, but in light of the events in Bolivia, we're interrupting that theme to do a special episode on what's going on in that region. It's really important in moments like this for Christians and leftists to go out of our way to express our solidarity. And if you haven't heard, on Sunday, Ava Morales, the president of Bolivia, was forced to resign by the military. Another word for that is a coup occurred in Bolivia. A lot has happened since then, and by the time that this episode airs, a lot more is going to happen, I'm sure. But to learn more for now, and we hope also to help our listeners figure out a way to engage the coup in Bolivia, we talked to Jim Hodgson of the United Church this week. He works with partners in Latin America and the Caribbean, and he has been involved in the region for 30 years. We talked to him in the past about Venezuela, so we appreciated him then, and we appreciate his perspective now.
Yeah, Jim's great. He's a great source on Latin America for sure, and he's got that good Christian vibe too, so it's helpful. Well, even since doing this interview, there have been some significant changes. So, for example, Janine Inez Chavez, a politician in Bolivia, declared herself president while carrying a Bible into the palace. Many members of the Bolivian Senate refused to vote to confirm her as president, but she assumed the office anyways. It's weird when all those people who are concerned about things like legal process and rule of law line up behind someone subverting all those things, but there it is.
Yeah, with all the news about the coup floating around, I think it's also important to recognize the gains the Morales government made in Bolivia. So not only is Morales the country's first indigenous leader, which is really important for a lot of reasons, but also social reforms under Morales really radically changed the country and moved it in a direction totally different from the direction that was being proposed by one of his predecessors, Carlos Mesa, who was also his opponent in the most recent presidential election. Mesa is his kind of arch nemesis in some ways. Before Morales became president, Mesa was promoting an economy that was devoted to international capital, to international privatization of all kinds of things. Morales, though, and the movement towards socialism, which is the party and the movement that Morales comes out of, they opposed Mesa and demanded the nationalization of hydrocarbons. And it's a pretty dramatic and amazing story. If you ever want to feel kind of excited about the possibility of grassroots socialism, you can read a lot more about that. And it led to Morales being elected in 2005 after Mesa resigned following all of this public pressure.
So after that, after Evo was president, the coming years marked a really drastic improvement for Bolivians. And, there's a lot that could be said about that. Lots of stuff about literacy rates and so on. But there's a good summary of this in The Guardian from 2014. And I'm just going to read it right here. According to a report by the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, Bolivia has grown much faster over the last 8 years than any period over the last 3.5 decades. The benefits of such growth have been felt by the Bolivian people under Morales. Poverty has declined by 25%, and extreme poverty has declined by 43%. Social spending has increased by more than 45%, and the minimum wage has increased by 87.7%. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean has praised Bolivia for being one of the few countries that has reduced inequality. So a lot going on there to think about.
Yeah, and we should keep thinking about it. We should remember all this history when we start hearing narratives about the coup. There are a lot of stories going around that try to tell a specific narrative about Morales as a person, about the Bolivian government, etc. But it's important to kind of keep the long history in mind when we hear that as well. Things are going to change rapidly in the coming weeks. Like we said earlier, they're going to change by the time this episode goes to air. In the meantime, we'll be following Jim's work, especially in trying to learn more about the situation. We think Christians and leftists have a duty to oppose imperialism and the attempt to roll back all these gains made by marginalized people. There's lots of ways to show solidarity in a time like this. If you live in a city, for example, like I do in Toronto, there's probably a rally going on this week, so you should go to that if you can. And if you can't, or if you don't live in a city, you might consider taking time out of your day to really dig into the history and issues around these events and encourage other people to do the same thing. That might seem like kind of a small thing that you can do, but it's definitely better than nothing, and it's also more than most people are going to do. If you spend any amount of time on social media too, you probably have noticed that there's all kinds of stories and counter stories already flying around. In the midst of these stories, practicing solidarity might be something as simple as urging folks who aren't politically aware to dig into these stories some more. In any case, it's definitely not a time to be quiet or to offer liberal criticisms or say, these are the laundry list of problems with Evo Morales or with his government or something like that. This is an opportunity for the left to express their wholesale rejection of imperialism, and we can save all those other criticisms for later or amongst ourselves.
Yeah, that's a good note. Well, Jim will have a lot more to say about all of this in a minute, but the thing that sticks out for us is his advice to view politics through the lens of the preferential option for the poor. And that means being anti-imperialists. So what you're about to hear is an interview that Dean did with Jim Hodgson. I'm not in this one, unfortunately. It's no big deal. My son had a snow day at school, and I had to hang out with him today, and it was great, just the same. But I didn't get to talk to Jim Hodgson, which was kind of a bummer, but that's fine. We watched X-Men instead. Pretty good. So anyways, here's Jim and Dean, not the X-Men.
This week on the Magnificast, we're joined again by Jim Hodgson, who works as the program coordinator for Latin America and the Caribbean at the United Church of Canada. Jim came on the show in the past, episode 98, feels like a long time ago, but it wasn't, in fact, that long ago, to talk to us about Venezuela during a kind of similar event. And we're happy to have you back, Jim, to give us some insight on Bolivia. Could you introduce yourself a little bit, maybe, and just say something about the kind of work that you do and why this is of interest to you?
Sure. It's good to be back in touch and chatting again. I work with the United Church of Canada, which is the largest Protestant church in Canada, made up of Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists who came together about 90 years ago. So the church has a pretty strong social justice focus, and pretty good on inclusion and indigenous rights, and we have been working with partners in Latin America since the 1960s. Before that, the focus was more Asia and Africa. And I guess in Latin America, getting involved in the 60s meant we were kind of contemporaneous with the evolution of liberation theology and the Church of the Poor and such movements. And that's kind of been a large part of my focus. My own background is Roman Catholic. And in Canada, I think we've had a good experience most of the time of ecumenical collaboration among the Roman Catholic Church and the major Protestant churches anyway. And that's kind of what makes it possible for the United Church to hire somebody like me to do this kind of work, that shared history. So, and I guess maybe just one other thing to add by way of introduction. I'm talking to you today from San Jose, Costa Rica. I'm near the end of a 3-week journey visiting partners in Colombia, Nicaragua, and now Costa Rica. Just got here today. and I think maybe some of the experiences in Nicaragua may shape some of what I have to say about Bolivia, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, well, we welcome for sure those kinds of connections and insights. We're grateful to be able to hear from you in this context. So just to maybe get the basic themes on the table here, news broke this past week on Sunday, the 10th, about events in Bolivia that, we, I guess, think is a coup. Matt and I, media outlets have been reticent to call it that, preferring different kinds of ways of talking about the lead up to these kinds of things. But could you give us maybe a short take or a recap on this event, or how you kind of have seen these events play out as you've been in Latin America yourself?
It's a big question, and
it is.
So, I guess the immediate, I'll start with the immediate and then maybe work backwards. And so the immediate things that happened were a general election a couple of weeks ago. The count came in slowly. Evo Morales, the president, indigenous president of Bolivia, running for his third term, was kind of close to reaching a 45% threshold, under which he wouldn't have to do a runoff election against his closest competitor if the closest competitor was further than 20 points back. And so some people thought there would be a runoff, but within hours, as the votes came in from the rural areas, it became clear he was up to about 47%. Now, this is what is disputed by some. They think there's fraud and so on. And Evo Morales tried to be quite transparent, I think, and invited the Organization of American States to come in and sort of do an audit of the count. And the OAS issued a very preliminary report saying, well, there's some problems here. That seemed to be kind of a tipping point, and push came to shove. There were demonstrations, and then an army general on Sunday morning said, "We suggest you leave." And Evo responded, "Well, for the good of the Bolivian people and to avoid violence, I will leave." And so he. This is where, people sometimes say, oh, it's not a coup, he quit. But when the general says, we suggest you leave, it kind of sounds like a threat. So that's where, I kind of come down on the side of it's a coup. And then jumping ahead a bit, now the test is what kind of interim government emerges. So far they seem to be having trouble putting something together. It's Tuesday now. And then how soon will there be new elections? And then under new elections, can can Morales himself participate? Can his party, the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism, can they participate? So that's kind of like the recent, the most recent set of events. I guess.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and there's deeper background I can go into about ecological issues and indigenous issues and all that stuff.
Yeah, we'll get to that for sure. But that helps us get kind of the immediate backdrop on the table here. And we should note too that Ava Morales has gone to Mexico on asylum now. I just read that recently too.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so as we think about these kinds of things, you've suggested, and I think this is really helpful, that an important framework for looking at politics in Latin America and these events in particular in Bolivia is the preferential option for the poor, a concept that comes from liberation theology. What do you think that means, and why is that a helpful way to contextualize what's going on?
I think for many of us who've worked in Latin America, the option for the poor, the preferential option for the poor, is kind of a way of looking at issues, as you say. So who benefits, who loses, while we're waiting for the what we all hope for, a perfect democracy or, social, some sort of 21st century socialism with a human face and social justice and voices for all, or a reshaping of power, whatever, seems to me wise not to make things worse for the people for whom, or among whom, or with whom you have sided and who your allies are. So what do I mean by that? I think in these skirmishes, I guess, of the left in power, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, yes, there are real issues in each of those situations that I think everybody is open to talking about. But when you hitch your environmental wagon or your indigenous rights wagon to the to U.S.-led imperialism or the Chamber of Commerce or mining companies or what have you, you're going to run into trouble. So I've just come from Nicaragua to Costa Rica, and I think that what happened in Nicaragua may help us understand a bit of what happened in Venezuela.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so in Nicaragua, in 2018, students began protesting, really over something a little odd for students to be protesting the changing of pension arrangements. You know, when I was 18 or 20, I wasn't quite sure what a pension was, but I wouldn't have any assurance that I would ever benefit from one. But anyway, so and then it kind of ended up in this alliance, the students together with the Chamber of Commerce, with the some of the feminist organizations, some of the LGBT organizations, some farmers groups, and it was I think a very strange kind of alliance, and so the uprising happened in April, went on for several months. There was violence on both sides, I'm convinced, from the government and from the opposition. And I went myself in August last year twice to kind of get a sense of this. And in one of the visits, we had a meeting with what was called the Civic Alliance. So it was this range of groups that included academics, the Business Council, or Chamber of Commerce, as I'm calling it, students, women, and so on. And what made me sad was that the Civic Alliance was absolutely unwilling to say with any clarity but what they hoped for. I mean, they wanted the president, Daniel Ortega, and his wife, Rosario Murillo, gone. But beyond that, they had no platform. So what will you do with public health care? What will you do with public education? Well, they wouldn't say. They would say, well, that's for the parties to sort out. And to me, that's not good enough. If you're going to denounce what is, then surely you have to pronounce what you are for. And that they wouldn't even say that they were for the poor, for justice for the poor, for healthcare, for public education, those minimal things made me extremely suspicious of them. So you look at what's going on in Bolivia, and of course, I want to appreciate the dissident voices for the environmental movement, some of the indigenous folk that did have legitimate claims. But I felt in my times visiting Bolivia that there was space for talking those through. There was space for debate. So my last visit was in 2015. One of the things I did then was visit an environmental organization working in southern Bolivia, and together we went to visit a tin mine, the Huanuni mine, and it was fascinating because there was no sort of military or police or security control. We could go in, we could walk around, we could take pictures, we could see the water from the tailings pond dumping into the rivers that go into a lake, absolutely filthy. We could talk about it. The environmental organization was publicly denouncing it and hoping for change. And they felt then that they could work within the system to produce the kind of change that they wanted. Now, that was 4 years ago, so I'm not quite sure what's happened with that particular mine since then. I will ask one of these days. there was another incident back in 2011 where the government wanted to build a highway through an ecological reserve that was indigenous controlled, and the indigenous people in the zone, this is called the Tipnis Park, Tipnis, if you want to look it up. So Tipnis was kind of one of those serious conflicts that challenged the government of Evo Morales. But again, I felt like, yeah, that's happening, and there were protests, but there were ways of talking things through. So you jump ahead to the last little while. Maybe another critique that has some merit is that the Evo Morales government, like the Ortega government in Nicaragua, has just outlived its welcome. I remember in Mexico when I lived there, the value of what's affirmed over and over of no re-election, in the old PRI system, the party that ruled Mexico for 70 years. The only kind of democracy that people had was the change of leaders every 6 years, and there was some value to that, I felt. And Evo this time was running for a third term. There had been a referendum in 2016 about whether there should be term limits or not, and Evo actually lost the referendum and then ignored the result, so was running again despite that referendum result. So I mean, there are reasons to complain. There are reasons to question the quality of democracy, when the president ignores the referendum result. But I don't think that those reasons are sufficient and sufficient to overthrow the government, to launch a coup, especially because the historical record in Bolivia and elsewhere shows that the people who get power after such events tend to be the worst enemies of the poor, of the ecological defenders, of the indigenous people. You get this, in the Bolivian context at least, this sort of white elite from Santa Cruz over and against the indigenous people who were pushed up into the mountains. And you can see signs of that, the way that some of the white elite opponents of Evo Morales entered the National Palace with the Bible, the way others have burned the indigenous flag in public. Those things are deplorable. But my fear is that instead of getting a government that's more responsive to indigenous people or environmental concerns or the concerns of women, we're going to get something that's much, much worse. Tom? Maybe?
Yeah. Well, could you tell us something a little bit more about some of these differences in Bolivian society and how that relates to looking at these things with the preferential option for the poor? You just mentioned this contrast between the white elite and indigenous people who are in the mountains and this sort of thing. How does sort of race and class come together maybe in the movement towards socialism? And how it is trying to give a voice to these groups. And how do those two things come together or not come together in the opposition toward that thing? Do you have any sense of, on the ground, how these two groups kind of shake out?
Yeah, it's, again, being far away from Bolivia right now, so I'm watching some of the same things you may be, also reading media from the area in Spanish. Maybe that would be a difference. So if you look back at Bolivian history, it's always been a struggle between a wealthy minority, which is lighter skinned, and the much larger indigenous or sometimes mestizo peasant population, and towards the end of the 90s, the indigenous people began to show the kind of power that they had, and there was a whole succession of governments that lasted, a year, a few months, what have you. because the indigenous people simply would not accept those people in power anymore. And so finally we got to around 2006 and Evo Morales miraculously won the election. And then things changed. There was a stable government. There was a government that tried to use the resources of the nation for the benefit of everyone and not just the elite, not just themselves. And I think for the most part did a very good job. There's all kinds of social indicators, literacy, income distribution, that show the impact that a government that an imperfect government, the impact that they could make in improving the lives of most people over 13 years, I guess. And so what's happening now, my fear, of course, is that some of that will be done or turned back. I mean, and you look at Brazil next door, where without an election, the opposition got power with demonstrably false accusations made against the previous Labour Party president, Dilma Rousseff, and her predecessor, Lula da Silva. So the right got power without an election and then set out to undermine, undercut, overturn every bit of socially progressive legislation that had been passed in the previous decade. So that's the I think it's important to remember that Evo Morales is the first indigenous president of any country in South America, only the second in all of Latin America, the first being Benito Juarez in Mexico in the mid-19th century. This experiment should not have ended this way. And maybe just one other thought. I mean, Lula da Silva, the former president of Brazil, just got out of jail less than a week ago. My goodness, there's been a lot of events just recent days. So Lula got out of jail. The Supreme Court finally got the case and finally said, no, there's no reason to, on these relatively trivial charges, to be holding him in jail, for heaven's sake. So they released him. So what he said yesterday in the wake of the coup is that he just feels sad that in Latin America we still have an economic elite that does not know how to live with democracy or with social inclusion, and social inclusion of the most impoverished people. And I think that's the key. So, he didn't even say it as strongly as I would. If he said that the elite can't live with social inclusion of the most impoverished people, they certainly can't live with the poor people in power. And I think that's a lesson that I've been learning and relearning over and over in the 35 years that I've spent in Latin America. It goes back to the struggles in the 80s in Central America, the Sandinista revolution, and everything that the United States did then with the Contras and everything else to subvert the Sandinista government then, and then the resources that they invested in defeating the guerrilla movements in El Salvador and Guatemala. So we've got peace supposedly in Central America, peace at the point of a gun, a U.S. gun. But look where the refugees are coming from, where the flow of migrants to the U.S. border. Where are they coming from? Those countries that the United States refused to allow change to occur in. And that there's, what in our option for the poor, standing with the poor in trying to perceive things from the perspective of the poor now, I think broadly understood, not just people who are poor economically, but also impoverished because of their lack of access to power. So women, LGBT people, indigenous people, Afro-Hondurans, among others, the indigenous in Bolivia. Yeah.
I mean, you when we had you back on, earlier to talk about Venezuela, you were talking about this too, and I thought that was such a good point to sort of drive home that when the previously excluded people in a social order get power, that can be seen as a dangerous thing. This might seem like sort of an obvious question, but I'd love to hear you talk more about that. In the early 21st century, and then at the tail end of the 20th century, as you were saying, in Nicaragua, there were a number of sort of new progressive and somewhat socialist, in different ways, governments that popped up kind of within just a few decades all over, it seemed. So some people refer to that as the pink tide. There are other names or analytics. And I guess we're curious to hear why do you think that wealthy nations outside of Latin America don't want that to happen, or that they're trying to sort of support opposition to it within these countries? What is so threatening about redistributing income or giving indigenous people a place in authority or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an excellent question, and I think it's part of you can ask the same question in the United States or Canada about racism. Why is there such persistent refusal to, in the U.S. context, extending voting rights to everyone without barriers, like the identification or restricting access to voting booths and all that stuff? Well, it's racism. Well, why is there racism? It's just stupid. But some people evidently feel that the power that they have has to be held on to at all costs. On a bigger scale, the corporations want access to resources in Bolivia, in Venezuela too. Those would be the two biggest factors, I think, in the external opposition to the governments of Bolivia and Venezuela. So what also, and it has to be admitted, the Venezuelan government and the Bolivian government didn't make a lot of progress breaking away from the dependence on resource extraction. And that's something I was looking for and hoped for, and some other people, like there's a writer whose name is Pablo Salon, Bolivian, who was part of the government for a time. That was what he hoped for too, and it didn't happen. So he eventually left the government and became one of those external critics. But at the same time, my goodness, Bolivia, when Morales came in, there were these treaty obligations, export obligations that the country had to Argentina and Brazil. It had to export certain quantities of natural gas to Argentina or Brazil, or they'd be in trouble. And that was part of the backdrop to that Tipnis conflict that I mentioned before. So unless you break the deals or negotiate a new deal, then you're kind of stuck in this dependence role, and you don't have a whole lot of resources to play with in experimenting with alternatives. I think something people always forget is the shape of the Latin American economies, the shape of the economies in the Americas. And a couple of years ago, I heard somebody say that 80% of the economic activity in the Americas takes place in Canada and the United States, and the other 20% goes on from Mexico to Argentina and Chile. So we're not talking about level playing fields at all when we talk about economic justice or redistribution or alternatives to resource extraction. That a whole lot of investment is required in Bolivia or Venezuela or Mexico to change the economic dependence on oil, gas, and minerals. I think I've probably gone off topic here from where you're
Yeah, no, that's good. That's great. I mean, I had hoped to ask you a bit more about that piece of the story too. So happy to have that. So I'm curious too about your own work for the United Church, and as somebody developing these relationships in Latin America, and what it's like to be observing these kinds of events, like what happened in Venezuela, what's going on in Bolivia now, as you're talking with people in other countries. So have you sensed any kind of reaction, for instance, to what's happening in Bolivia? Do your partners seem affected by it? Do they have, maybe their own concerns that they're worried about, and you're trying to put all these things together? How does that work in your own sort of day-to-day work, building these relationships so that you can have an idea of, what the poor are saying?
Yeah, it's always fascinating to be kind of in a context, in my case, the Nicaraguan one, the past few days, and then something else happened somewhere else. And I think, so my sense of people in Bolivia is that they are kind of crossing their fingers and hoping for the best, that, and the indigenous people have been marching yesterday and today. I think that they will be pretty clear about what they'll accept and what they won't accept. And I think that has also made it difficult, and this is a good thing, made it difficult for the opposition to pull together a government. So we'll see how that goes. Outside, I mean, it's kind of another knock on those possibilities for change that I was talking about before. If you go back, like in the 1959, the Cuban Revolution, guerrilla wars through the 60s and 70s, by the end of the 80s, it was pretty clear that the use of civil war violence or guerrilla war was not kind of broadly acceptable anymore to bring about change. Despite the Allende experiment in Chile in 1970 through 73, which he was elected through a democratic election and then overthrown by a military coup. Through the 80s and since then, people have used elections to try to hold power. So, you have the poor people working in systems that were invented by the rich to keep themselves in power. And, so Hugo Chavez at the end of 1988 won power in Venezuela. Lula da Silva in Brazil, after three election tries, he finally won power, and I think it was 2001. And that kind of set the pink wave, the pink tide, as you say, in motion. And then suddenly people tried the same kinds of things in other places. And really what was amazing in that period for me was seeing how people were gathering in spaces like the World Social Forum or the Americas Social Forum, so first in Porto Alegre in Brazil, but then in other places, and kind of hammering out policy alternatives. Well, we don't want privatization of water, but what do we want? We don't want privatization of education, but what do we want? What do we want in terms of healthcare and so on? What do we want for environmental change? And those became, the smart politicians paid heed and ran on those campaign platforms and won. The pink tide ebbed, so that the past 5 years or so, suddenly the other side has the upper hand. These more U.S.-friendly governments. Colombia never did change, but and Peru never really changed either. But then Colombia, Peru, Argentina went to the right. There was this sort of democratic or judicial coup in Brazil that turned it to the right. Now you've got this. I guess two things fairly close in time. Argentina has returned to power a more progressive branch of the Peronist party, and that is hopeful. They have denounced the coup. Mexico, just over a year ago, elected a progressive president. That was good news. But now Bolivia falls, and it feels like a setback. It is a setback for indigenous people, and we hope, and the partners that I work with hope, that it's a temporary setback, that things can be recovered, and that new ideas will emerge, and that other alternatives will still be proposing alternatives into the future. And I think that's where the United Church partners have largely called the event a coup and regretted it and call for protection at this time of human rights of people whose rights may not be respected by whoever wins this struggle. The indigenous people, the poor people, the women, the farmers. It's just, to my mind, you're gambling a whole lot when you throw your environmental movement on the side of the business leaders and the white elite in Bolivia. You put everything at risk. You put all of the past 15 years of advances in jeopardy. And I think that before you do that kind of thing, you should think carefully about what the consequences of your opposition to a fairly good government are.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that really helps to contextualize what's at stake here. You work with these partners in Latin America on behalf of the United Church in Canada. What do you think is at stake for Christians here in Canada or in the U.S. Or elsewhere? How can Christians maybe find ways to express solidarity or do something that shows, that these partners that you're working with, for instance, aren't alone, or that there are people in these other countries that have their governments have wealthy interests in extractives in places like Bolivia. Not all the people, are behind that. What can Christians do maybe to express that solidarity?
I think a lot of people support their churches and their churches' actions against poverty, for the rights of migrants, and so on. Those things are important and strong and growing. I think having a clearer political analysis helps. It's always seemed to me that there's a lot of goodwill. The charity impulse is strong amongst Christians in North America, but I think it has to go beyond that. It even has to go beyond kind of a development model. It's not just about, these people are suffering from underdevelopment, therefore they must have development. Development is this complex thing that is, kind of popular both with capitalists and with Marxists. You build hydroelectric dams and think you've got development. But I think what the Bolivian experience was trying to say to us was, we want education and we want healthcare and we want participation, and the only way we can afford to pay for those things is to continue in this resource dependency mode. I think we need to develop our political lens. So in the United Church a few years ago, almost a decade ago now, we began trying to work with people around the concept of empire. Not quite saying imperialism, but certainly around empire. Like, who has power? How is power used? What kinds of power are we talking about? Economic power, political power. Power, I think we were learning, is always oppressive, colonial, patriarchal. How do we name that and see who benefits and who loses, and what can be done to change that? And I must say, it's an uphill struggle for me working in the United Church. I feel like when I say the kinds of things I'm saying to you today, I sometimes offend people who would rather I only talk about, projects or development in a narrow sense, or charity. But I think that the times demand of us, the gospel demands of us a stronger commitment. So that, and so what I see hopeful in the so-called pink wave is like people trying to use politics for what politics should be used for, the common good, working out issues in public ways, debating issues, trying to reimagine power so that it's not used over and against other people, but rather used to serve the people who most marginalized. I love the Zapatista phrase from Chiapas in Mexico, mandar obedeciendo, to rule by obedience to the people. That puts a pretty heavy responsibility on politicians to be listening to the people, so that they're always obeying the people. But it also puts a weight on people to be educated about the issues that they're wrestling with. Like you can't go into, as people in Ontario did a year ago, or people in the United States did in 2016, sort of thinking by throwing out the old gang, you'll get something better. You don't. You in both cases, in the province of Ontario in Canada and then the United States, by throwing out the old gang, you got something much worse. And that has an impact on the people, hopefully we care about the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to ask you a bit more too about, you have a background working with Christians who had a history of international solidarity movements, of opposing imperialism, of trying to study and do this sort of political education work that you're talking about now. As younger Christians, Matt and I both trying to find our way in all of that, it can be difficult to find connections and to find these kinds of groups. And much of what we find is, from the 70s and 80s and 90s. Do you have any advice, given your own participation in those kinds of movements? What is sort of useful in building those kind of solidarity links? What kind of power can Christians leverage on behalf of the poor in their own countries and people around the world?
I think there's kind of two levels of answering that. I think one of the things that happened in the because of the emergence of liberation theology and these progressive social movements and the concept of the Church of the Poor and so on in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was that it resulted in a backlash. So the Pope John Paul and then Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict, blasted back. And I think that some people who had been part of those faith-based efforts for change and saw potential in working through church spaces gave up and left, or put their energy into other sort of civil society kinds of movements. And so, I look around at the people I was working with in the 80s and who's around me still. Yeah, there's some, but others have gone on to other things. Sometimes people maybe found a different church to do their work in. In my case, yeah, Roman Catholic. That's my spirituality, my kind of preferred whatever worship style anyway. But the United Church has become home to a lot of jaded Roman Catholics and people from other denominations who kind of got tired of how slow things were moving. So anyway, I still draw hope and light from the from elders, people who've been in these movements for a lot longer than me. There aren't as many around as there used to be. But like in Toronto, I go to a Jesuit parish, and I listen to those guys because they've been doing this for 40, 50 years, and they're pretty strong in what they believe. There's some of the religious communities also, and then I think at the same time, sort of carry those ideas or that spirituality of struggle, that spirituality of justice, into work in other circles. So the ecological movement, indigenous rights circles, solidarity movements, and I think people, like, I always find it interesting. You can trace this right back into the 30s and 40s when the United Church and the Canadian Labour Congress were like the only two bodies in the country that opposed the removal of the Japanese Canadians from the coast. So sometimes unions understand even yet the progressive Christian social justice impulse better than some of the more secular organizations. So, like hanging out with the union people, like, it helps me build my sense of faith and solidarity, and hang in there for the next round.
Yeah, I mean, that's great advice. Something that we certainly appreciate here at the Magnificast. Well, I guess as we kind of come to the top of our conversation, all these events in Bolivia are extremely fresh. We're recording this on Tuesday. Usually our episodes go up on Friday, so I'm sure, by the time we get there, all kinds of other things will have happened. For people who are trying to observe these things, trying to have a lens through which to look at it, like you said, with a preferential option for the poor, what kinds of questions would you be asking about, news reports that you see come by, or headlines, or sources? And maybe how would you suggest, if somebody really wants to try to get their hands on, how to really express solidarity in a situation like this, what kinds of materials would be useful in that sort of process? Do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, there's kind of general things. I guess, read media critically. The Canadian media aren't using the word coup. That says something. There's some discussion right now about whether, or to what extent, this coup is driven by the transnationals' drive to get access to Bolivia's lithium resources, the stuff that goes into cell phone batteries and electric cars. What role do those sort of big economic issues and the big economic power issues have in all of this? A good source for me is an organization in the United States, CEPR. And I've forgotten what the first C is, but it's about economic policy and research. Mark Weisbrot is the genius there. He just put out a really good piece on Friday about the what's at play in Bolivia. I find Mark always insightful and usually spot on. And I think, and I think those of us who've kind of said, well, yeah, I think it's a coup and I think it's illegitimate, and I really wish that Evo had been allowed to claim victory and continue in power. At the same time, I think there's an occasion for us all to listen a bit to debates on the left and hear the voices of those who are asking questions about how does the left renew itself? How do you over time avoid situations where somebody who was a good leader in a particular moment is still there 15 years or 30 years later, and what can be done to sort of renew generational leadership, avoid holding on too long, avoid personalizing issues. We shouldn't be electing, it's true, we shouldn't be electing leaders for life. Power is to serve. And so don't dismiss the voices that may not have agreed with in their strategic choice for opting for the Chamber of Commerce in this instance, but at the same time had some good questions to ask. So take the question seriously, even while you wish that this had gone some other way. And then I think we also have to really watch in the days ahead what does happen with human rights, what does happen to the people who were solid supporters of Evo Morales. Will their lives be endangered because of that? What happens to the indigenous people more broadly?
Yeah, we'll definitely be on the lookout for that. As a final question to put it to you, you've already suggested some things about this and circled around it and talked about it a bit too. But just putting it simply, I suppose, what's the Christian responsibility in a political moment like this? What are Christians supposed to do or called to do? And what do you wish that you saw more of them doing? You're fighting these uphill battles sometimes in the United Church. what do you hope that that church, the rest of us who call ourselves Christians, would do in a moment like this?
Well, I guess stand with the most vulnerable, stand with the poor. I think again, people will choose their fights, and I rejoice in that. So many people are noticing what's going on the U.S.-Mexico border and denouncing it and doing what they can to shed light on the migrant experience and the refugee situations. There've been kind of consistent visits of solidarity, consistent call-outs about what's going on, and I think that over time is changing people. But on these other kinds of issues, the political issues further away, do some reading, ask some questions, write to me if you want, and or phone me. And it's so what I hope people would do is stand with the poor, stand with the people who are most abused and most subject to abuse. It's like an option for the poor isn't sort of saying, I will stand with the poor no matter what, like a blind ideological position. It's sort of saying, well, I will read and listen and hear. And when in doubt, stand with the poor, stand with the people who are marginalized, stand with the people who benefit the least. Denounce those who benefit the most. Try to encourage dialogue and try to encourage mutual understanding. Try to hear from each other, but know that we've got to keep on pressing power, so the power will change, so that it does serve the people rather than the other way around.
That's great. I can also attest that if you do write to Jim Hodgson, he will write you back. So grateful for that. Jim, we're so thankful for all the work that you're doing. Thankful too to be able to have you on this episode of the podcast and get a little insight from you. And we wish you all the best as you wrap up these visits in Costa Rica now, and look forward to hearing too what happens with all of that once you've processed it and come back.
Thanks, Dean. I love what you do, and I love the Magnificast. Keep up the good work.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, and you know you did, then you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can also follow us on Twitter. We have a Facebook group, the Magnificast Basement. A few people have joined it this week. What's up, you basement people? Yeah, cool. The intro music is from Amaria Armstrong, and the outro music is, as always, by The Illogical Spoon. So we'll see you next week.
I wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind